So I guess we'll kind of begin with a bit of an agenda for what it is. So a short agenda, this is a short workshop. I'm going to run through kind of how we at the Calgary kind of SDG Alliance, how we define sustainable teams, what sorts of core elements we think of when we talk about our own succession planning. And then I'll end it with some of the resources and tools that we've developed and that maybe you can take inspiration from or take a look at to see if any of that will be helpful for you in looking at your own succession planning efforts or onboarding efforts in your respective initiatives that you're involved with. So for us, some of the kind of key elements that we think of is when we think of sustainable teams, we think of ones that are diverse. And that diversity really helps to add a lot of different perspectives, lived experiences, knowledge, to really enrich a team, to ensure that it can, weather a transition. If you have new folks entering, having that diverse wealth of knowledge to help onboard them is critical. We think of sustainable teams as ones that are kind of interdisciplinary or multi or transdisciplinary, in that there's lots of different skills and kind of that same notion of lots of different perspectives also being infused into a team. And then finally, they're visionary. So the SDG Alliance at Calgary was founded in 2017, and something that we've always thought of as we were building it was that, we need to be thinking long-term. Where do we hope to get this organization in a few years? What is it going to take to get there? And one of those conversations as well was, what type of human capacity do we need? A lot of us, when we first started the organization, were kind of in our first or second year of university. So when we started it, we knew that in a few years, most of our original team would be graduating. So starting to think about planning, how do we incorporate new people into this team to really ensure that we have longevity in our programming and that it isn't kind of interrupted by a sudden exodus of people graduating and moving on to new things. So these are sort of the three kind of fundamentals that we think of. Does anyone have any other kind of thoughts to add to this? Any questions so far? No? Okay.
Yeah,
yeah.
So it's Michelle. I think that after we graduate, but if we really enjoyed our school experience, maybe having some kind of mentoring to continue the pathway if they want to do any work in SDGs and to kind of to bridge that gap, because I find that a lot of times I know it just started, but a lot of graduate students and stuff like that I've met in my organization, they took a lot of time off, and I'm not rushing into anything, or they're not rushing into, but it's just it will help with the transition in terms of employment.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And that's something we're going to touch on a little bit towards the end of this, is making sure you have a really good mentorship period and onboarding to ensure that new folks that are entering an organization or people taking on a new role during this kind of period of transition have the opportunity to ask questions, to gain the skills that they need to be successful in guiding your organization in whatever future it's going in. Absolutely. So yeah, that mentorship component is a critical part of this. So kind of a definition that we create and that we think about is that succession planning is ongoing and it's an intentional process. So it's not something that we sit down, have a conversation, draw up a plan, and then that's it. We don't really refer to it. It's something that we think about ongoing. So as we are thinking about doing our hiring, as we're planning out who's taking on what roles, that conversation about succession planning is ongoing. So that requires some sort of visionary thinking. It requires long-term foresight. And that this type of leadership requires diverse teams also that can effectively translate and pass down knowledge to new folks who are entering your organization. Oh. So some of the kind of core elements that we're going to run through when we're talking about succession planning, there's 4 of them that we consistently kind of refer to. So one of them is building that internal capacity. So Tyson earlier talked about internal and external hiring. So really thinking about building internal capacity within your organization to take on new leadership roles. Also thinking about external talent, so infusing your organization with people who have been external, who have different skills and perspectives that can really enrich your organization. We also want to think about hiring cycles of when we hire, when do we train, when do we onboard. And part of that also is that transition and handoff. So how does that look like, and things like that. So for building internal capacity, it's important to look to leaders within your own organization. So do they already possess organizational knowledge? They already have that history. Sometimes it's the easiest option. Let's say your organization's co-chair or president is stepping down, moving on to new things. You may look to the vice president or a director or someone in your organization that's already been with it for a while, because they do have a lot of this knowledge already. So it seems like the next logical step for them to move up. If you do have someone who kind of fits that description, do they have the skills, experience, and capacity to commit to this? If they do, maybe it's time to start thinking about a transition timeline. So for example, you heard from Tyson already. He was part of the SDGA for a year already in a different role before he started thinking about taking on the co-chair position. So myself and Katherine, who was the other co-chair, kind of sat down. We drew up a transition timeline of a year to say, okay, we've expressed interest in becoming the new co-chair. Let's have a conversation about how that might look like. What do you need to get there? How can we best help support you? So luckily we did have someone who kind of fit that description. If your organization doesn't have someone who readily appears to take on this role, is it something that you can mentor or coach or develop? And if not, that's okay too. Sometimes organizations also need kind of an external perspective. So if we can't find ideal fits within our organizations, we can always look externally to kind of find external talent as well. Oh, yeah, and external talent. So it can really infuse your organization with new perspectives. And it does require some extra steps. So it is a bit more difficult in that sense. Something that we always like to think of is if they're a good fit. So that really means taking a deep dive into your organization's values and dynamics. Does this person kind of vibe? Like, for example, we're all working in sustainability or the SDGs of some sort. So, you know, do they really support the SDGs? Are they passionate about this field, or are they looking for something to kind of build their resume with? So those were conversations that we had. And then second, do they have that skills, capacity? Do they have the resume needed to enrich your team in kind of building that leadership needed to continue doing the great work that we're all doing? So when we're thinking about external hiring, orientation and transitioning becomes even more important because they're external. They may not have that same history and knowledge of how everything works that someone internally may have. So all this talk about orientation becomes a lot more important as well. Does anyone have any questions at this point about kind of hiring, external talent versus internal?
I had a question,
yeah.
Michelle. You mentioned like the directors and stuff like that. I was just wondering, do you also, like, is the director, because of their experience specifically in this area, because SDGs is kind of like really big. Like, for example, me, like, I have experience with like outside, and even though I wasn't in like that hub, for example, like I have experience with like actually like solving some of the the big issues. So would that be taken into account, or is it, because like I just, sorry, I'm in a human rights sort of like lens, but it's just like in terms of like ageism, it's very much like does it mean that someone who's like older or the wiser or like the
No, not necessarily. So the SDGA at Calgary, so our organization is student run completely. So we have a partnership with the university where we're funded from the university, but we're fully student run. So whether that's undergraduate or graduate. So all of our kind of director positions, co-chairs, they're all on a volunteer basis, and we're all students. So when we are hiring students to take on this role, what we're really looking for is, do they have a passion for the SDGs? And as well, do they have kind of relevant experience, whether they're taking on an event planning position or are they taking on an advocacy position? We really want to know if they have skill sets that align with what we're looking to do. So that way there's a really good kind of match. We wouldn't want to hire someone into a position where their kind of skills don't match what we expect for them to do. That wouldn't be fair. So I hope that kind of answered your question. But yeah, we're always looking for people who have a passion and who really want to be there, because we want people to kind of help accelerate this work over the next 10 years of SDGs. We really want to keep people who are really passionate and motivated. So that's usually the number one thing we look for. And then, yeah.
I had other questions, but
yeah.
I just wanted to see if you have any questions before. No pressure.
No? Okay. Hello, PA. Welcome.
I'll be really quick.
Yeah.
The first one was with neurodiverse individuals. So like when you do presentations and like events or whatever, do you consider like their needs in order for the service to be delivered? Like for example, like subtitles or like Braille services or things like that. And then the second one is, what are ongoing initiatives that are you specifically doing for Indigenous people? And then how can they how do you continue the strive for reconciliation?
Yeah, so I guess to answer your first question regarding diversity with the hub, yes, so for all of our events, we always put out a call to make sure that if anyone has any accessibility needs, that they can self-identify and that they're accommodated. So whether that's physical accessibility, whether that's interpretation services, or kind of any sort of even dietary restrictions, and making sure that that is accommodated. And then additionally, I guess in terms of diversity within our team, it's not as if we have certain kind of quotas or anything of what we're looking for. We make sure we have a call that goes out to the entire campus community of anyone who's interested in joining our organization. But we do also kind of push specific hiring and opportunities to kind of traditionally underrepresented groups on campus. So talking to our campus's Writing Symbols Lodge, which is kind of like our Indigenous Student Center, pushing out information and resources to many of the traditionally Black student community groups on campus. Things like that to kind of enrich the diversity that we have on our team, because it's one thing to kind of say that we're diverse, and then it's another thing to actually be doing the work to get the word out to communities that are traditionally underrepresented in sustainability work. So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it is a really important aspect of when we're talking about hiring.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question, or next kind of section. So we were just talking about hiring a little bit, about whether we're hiring externally or internally. Another thing that we consider at Calgary is, when do we hire? And that, I think, is really important. We hire on 2 different cycles. So we hire in the winter, so this is like December, January, and then we also hire in the spring. The reason we do this is to kind of stagger the transfer of knowledge. So meaning that folks who are hired in December or January commit to basically like a year contract of working with our group. And they get to have a transition period with the executives who are in their role throughout kind of February to April, which is like the winter semester in Calgary. And then we do another hiring in spring to kind of hire any other spots that have become vacant, or if we didn't have any successful candidates in the previous hiring cycle. It basically is a secondary cycle to ensure that all of our positions are covered, our team is adequately staffed, to ensure that as we move into the summer, which is when we usually plan our programming, and then moving into September, which is when we usually launch all of our programming, we have a fully staffed team that has been trained, that feels comfortable enough in their role because they've been in it for a few months already, to ensure that they are really quite set up to be successful when everything kind of launches and it gets really busy. So kind of some reflective questions I have for you guys to think about as well. Obviously, all of our organizations' hiring practices are different, but reflect on if your own team, do you consider transition periods? Is there an emphasis on transferring knowledge? And does your team have enough capacity for what we like to call like peak periods? So for us, our peak period is in September and October. So really ensuring that all of our hiring is done previous to the summer, so that way we can transition throughout the summer. But if your peak period, for example, is in April, your cycle of when you're hiring people and training people, of course, is going to look a lot different. But these are kind of two reflective questions that I encourage you to think about as you want to try and make this process of hiring and training as seamless as possible, so that way we're not interrupting any of the programming that we want to deliver. Any questions about that? Does that kind of make sense?
If I could maybe ask a question,
Yeah.
So actually I have like two related to the same topic. I really find it interesting that you add that spring hiring instead of like making it like September, August. Have you experienced any difficulties regarding people committing before actually starting the next semester? Like during the whole summer, they might be doing other stuff. They might be doing an internship, working, just traveling. Have you had difficulty with that?
Yeah, so it's kind of, it definitely depends, and it's something that we really do make clear when we're doing the hiring process of that, during this kind of winter semester from January to April, we'll kind of transition and train you to take over starting, most of our positions start May 1st. But the SDGA for the most part we don't really have programming during the summer. So the summer is all about kind of research or developing programs and kind of doing all that back-end work. So we haven't had any issues with people leaving if they're doing internships or going abroad, as most of the work that they do is kind of on their own, setting up their portfolio and doing more of that planning work. It is, I will say, having two hiring cycles is a bit of a delicate balance because that's 2 times the amount of kind of interviews you have to run, and kind of like the logistical piece of it can be tricky. Typically for us, it's like the main thing that the co-chairs who kind of lead the alliance, it's their main role is to get that hiring done and to do it right, and to kind of help facilitate all of the training. So logistically, it can be tricky at some times, but we found it works best in ensuring that that transfer of knowledge happens properly between people who are leaving a role and people who are entering a role.
That's really great.
Yeah. Did you have any other questions?
I don't know. I don't want to monopolize time on that. I know you also have other slides. I'm going to keep it to you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, we'll move on to the next one then. Finally, so this is where we talk about transition. This is where I have most of the resources that we'll go through. Hopefully they'll be useful for some of you. So yeah, obviously transition, great opportunity to think about revisiting portfolio descriptions, talking about mandates and goals. One of the best practices we have is to ensure that you have an onboarding session with anyone new that you're bringing into your organization to kind of give them that orientation of what is expected of them, what kind of goals you have for them. But it's also a great time to, bring in new perspectives, talk about new things, and things like that. So yeah, that's why we always like to do, sorry, there's something going on in the chat. Never mind. And that doing a really good transition can also be really fun, right? We usually have some sort of dinner to onboard people. It's a great time for icebreakers, getting to know each other and doing that really good team building and relationship building that you like vitally need within an organization. So some of the tools that we use to do this, we have a few. So we have something called living documents, which we pass down from team to team as we transition throughout the years. It's living because we ask that each executive team updates it and revises it as the organization evolves. Basically, they're kind of critical documents that every single person who's part of our organization needs to read and needs to know. So we have things like organizational guides, onboarding checklists, event planning checklists, and kind of more like administrative backend stuff. I have one of them here to share with you. So this is our organizational guide. This is like our go-to if you want to know about what we do. This is where we go to. We made this to ensure that anyone new entering our alliance kind of is able to speak the same language, essentially, with what we're doing. So it goes through background, acknowledgement of the land, resources on why we do land acknowledgements, why that's important to the work that we're doing. We're talking about the SDGs, so we can't talk about that without talking about reconciliation. Really making sure that new people who are joining our organization are really understanding the basis of what we're trying to do. We have statements on intersectionality and why valuing diversity is important to the work that we do. We have our conduct statement as well as Braver Spaces statement. We go through a bit of a history just so people know what exactly our organization is, how it's structured, our mission statements, and purpose statements. We have also our values statement. This is like, I think, one of the biggest and most useful parts of this document as well, ensuring that new people joining our organization understand what our values are. So to be engaged, to commit to learning, to build community, and examples of what this looks like. And then finally, we do have kind of a list of key activities so folks know the type of programming that we typically do. And then we have a history of all the previous executives that have been part of this team. So I encourage you guys, if you don't already have one, to consider if you want to have some sort of living organizational guide for your own organizations, as it does help a lot with that transition and ensuring that everyone's basically on the same page. We also have things like communications guides, which are great for kind of brand standards, ensuring that new people who are working in social media or communications also are on the same page, which is really great too. Yeah, I guess I'll open it. Does anyone have any questions? I have a feeling we are running a little bit short on time. It looks like we have 5 minutes left. So I guess we'll kind of have a bit of a discussion. If you have any other thoughts to share, please do so. Oh, wait, I see. Okay, Michelle, I see your questions here. So for COVID, that's a really good question. So for COVID, we've basically just transitioned our meetings to the online sphere. We still usually have bi-weekly meetings with our teams just to keep them updated, check in on them. As I said before, during the summer, we usually we don't have as much programming. And we usually reserve this time more for planning the kind of events that we want to do throughout the year, doing some research, and kind of reevaluating what we want to do. So it's more independent in that sense of people working on their own portfolios, accomplishing their own tasks that we can just check in on them. So yeah, we don't really have any peak periods right now because of COVID. A lot of our programming has been put on hold. I would say, however, that our communications team has been trying to do some more research on the best ways to get resources out there for folks to kind of, as we deal with this COVID situation as it evolves, getting more resources out there to support people and or redirecting them to already existing university resources, I would say is the main thing that we're doing right now. And then other questions, facilitators and participants having equal space to work together on programming. How do you make space for that? So I would say it depends on what it is. We have events that are kind of more traditional, where we have like a keynote speaker. We have kind of question and answer periods, but then we also have other events that are more discussion based. most notably probably our International Development Week programming is a storytelling event. So we don't really have any sort of hierarchy. It really is an open space for people to share their experiences. It's usually around a certain theme. This past event that we did in February was focused on anti-Black racism and reconciliation in Canada. So huge focus on inviting Black storytellers, Indigenous storytellers to share their experiences navigating kind of racism and colonialism in Canada and in international development. So that was an event where we really focused on bringing in external expertise, really focusing on reaching out to specific student groups to gain their perspectives and stories, and providing a platform for us to have a discussion as a broader campus community about these topics. So that's an event where it really is talking on equal space and kind of sharing. And then your last question, how do you know if someone is motivated to continue to work on the SDGs for mentoring? So typically at the very end of the year, we usually send out a kind of anonymous survey to our team to ask, you know, how was your experience this year? What are you looking to do next? Are you looking to stay on with the SDGA, moving on to other things? How can we best support you? A survey like that could be really useful for gaining more information. And then usually as someone who's like leading an organization, having some sort of like open door policy with your team, if they want to move on to other things, that's totally okay. If they're looking for mentorship opportunities, whether you mentor them directly or you kind of connect them with other folks who may be a better fit, just having some sort of open door policy to ensure that people can kind of go to you if they have questions, and that you're able to redirect them to the right resources that they might need. I would say a question for you guys maybe is like, what stage are you at in terms of succession planning? Are you thinking about transitioning new folks into the roles that you're already in? Yeah, is that like an issue that people might be having on your own campuses?
Okay, well, maybe I will share. I guess like one issue we added a little bit of all, and yeah, it is like, you know, we did have like specific time for hiring. We were more like, okay, we add a need right now, we're gonna fill the need. But I think it's a really good point to have like hiring moment not during your peak period, because like this September we were doing hiring while working on like so many events at the same time, and that was like really, really exhausting.
Yeah.
Especially because we were like 3 or 4 people working, and we needed to like get 6 more other people at the same time. So I guess like that's a really good point, and I really love also the anonymous survey that you mentioned to get like feedback, but also to make sure that it's open for critiques and any kind of feedback that you would get. So thanks for sharing these.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, like having something like that anonymous survey does help a lot in ensuring that people feel comfortable with, yeah, sharing critiques, areas for improvement. Yeah, because all of our organizations are kind of evolving in new and exciting ways. Given COVID too, that's also kind of changed how we operate.